Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's session. My name is Sooz Kinsella, and I'll be your host today. Joining me is Jane Gotts, Director at GenAnalytics, and today Jane will review the current UK legislation which covers diversity and inclusion. So before we start, I just want to go over some basic housekeeping. So all attendees will be muted on arrival. And if you're experiencing any issues with the audio, if you look on the right-hand panel, you'll be able to choose computer audio, or you can also dial in if you're experiencing any issues with audio. Please do use the question panel as well throughout. I'll be on hand to help answer questions at the end of the session with Jane. Yeah, that should be us. So I think, welcome, Jane. Thank you for joining me today.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Sooz mentioned, I'm going to talk about the current landscape in the UK with regards to diversity and inclusion. But I also thought it would be helpful just to talk a bit around diversity and inclusion in general. What is it? Why this continues to matter? Is legislation driving change now? What can employers do to really push this agenda forward? And also, importantly, how your business and how your organisation will benefit from diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to have a conversation this morning with you all, and as Sooz mentioned, please use the panel to ask questions and we'll come back to these at the end. But this morning I'd like to have a conversation around race, around disability, around LGBT, and around gender, and I'm going to talk about this across our workforce and our economy. So I hope everyone's sitting comfortably, because some of the statistics that I will mention in my slides can make for some uncomfortable viewing. So here's some information around disability. I'm not going to go through each bullet point one by one, as you should be able to see these on the slides. But the important thing to recognise here that 50% of disabled people of working age are in work, compared to 80% of non-disabled people of working age. Now, when we continue to talk about skills challenges within the UK economy, the fact of the matter is that we are not harnessing the full talents of our workforce and the workforce that is available to us. I think it's also really important to recognise that people within the working population, and you'll see the statistic of 2%, actually become disabled each year. So as a business, something to think about is how accessible is your current business? How open are you to individuals with a disability? Do you have opportunities for individuals to come forward about any disabilities that they could have? How open is the culture that you have? From an economic perspective, disabled people earn £1.20 per hour, £1.20 per hour less than non-disabled people. And the big statistic at the bottom, that it will take 200 years to close the disability employment gap. When we look at actually the makeup of the workforce, we again have some telling statistics here. Disabled people are 3 times more likely to stop working than non-disabled people. 42% of disabled young people are not currently in education, training or employment, and that's a real loss to our workplaces and to our economy. The statistic I've got in the last bullet point about MAs, for those of you who are maybe joining us from down south, that's modern apprentices. So just over 9% of modern apprentices in Scotland were awarded to people classifying themselves as disabled. But if we look at the last statement that I make in the bottom of these slides, when we talk about a 5% rise in the employment rate amongst disabled adults, that would contribute an extra £6 billion to the UK economy by 2030. So these are statistics and information that we shouldn't just ignore. When we get on to race, again, we have some serious challenges in terms of the demographics of our workforce. 62.8% of the ethnic minorities are currently in work, compared to 75.6% for white workers. We have a serious challenge and a serious issue within the UK in terms of getting individuals from ethnic minorities through to senior management roles. And if we had full representation of black and ethnic minorities working in the UK, we would get another £24 billion boost to our economy, which is 1.3% of GDP. So these are really telling statistics in terms of the work that still needs to be done. When we talk about LGBT, there's serious challenges again in our economy, because many individuals don't feel that they can be open and honest about their sexual preferences and background when they're at work. And that creates a challenge when individuals don't feel comfortable about bringing their true selves to work. If you look at productivity levels within a workplace, people who feel comfortable, people who feel included, people who feel valued are much more likely to do better in work than those who don't. And that also creates an issue in terms of retaining talent. If you have talented individuals working for your business who don't feel that they're working in an inclusive environment, they're going to leave. They're going to leave for competitors potentially, and you're going to lose that talent. That's something I'll come on and talk a bit more about later. This whole agenda, while we talk about diversity and inclusion and we talk about legislation, really comes down to, is your business an inclusive place, and are you keeping and attracting talent? And that's talent, whether it's female talent, whether it's talent from ethnic minorities, whether it's talent for people with a disability, or whether it's talent for people who classify themselves as LGBT. The other issue that we can think about, and I'll talk about this again a bit later, is actually the spending power of people. And you can see at the bottom there, I've said that around £70 billion is earned and spent by LGBT people in the UK every year. So the big area, which I'm sure many of you are aware of due to recent government legislation, has been the gender pay gap. And I'm going to talk about this for the next while during this presentation, because for the first time, this has really highlighted the issue within many workforces up and down our country. There is still a lot of misconception around the gender pay gap, and hopefully over the next few slides, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail. And I'm sure your businesses are already looking at this, but just for information, the gender pay gap rate in Scotland is 16%. In the UK, it is slightly higher at 18%. Many of you, I'm sure, will be aware of this, but it's important to highlight that it is not the same as equal pay, and therefore it is not illegal for businesses to have a gender pay gap. And that's particularly important if you are talking to employees about the gender pay gap. When a lot of the press were talking about the pay gap earlier this year, there was misunderstandings about the difference between the gender pay gap and equal pay. So I think it's very important, if you are talking to staff about your gender pay gap within your business, that it isn't the same as equal pay. So why does this matter? The first two circles represent the figures in Scotland. The gender pay gap in Scotland means that women earn on average £182.90 per week less than men. Women account for 70% of all part-time workers in Scotland. Globally, it's estimated that it's going to take 170 years to close the gender pay gap, and that's based on the current rate of change. If the Scottish economy was able to close the gender pay gap within workforces across the country, we would get a £6.5 billion economic boost. So what do we know now based on the legislation that was introduced last year? The legislation, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, looked at mean and median gender pay gaps within any business that has over 250 employees. And I'll talk about this again in the slides coming up. I think it's important not to just look at the headline figures. Some of these were seriously high, some of them were low, but it only tells part of the story when we look at the mean and the median gender pay gap. What's been very interesting is the pay quartiles, and that has been companies requiring to report on 4 quartiles: the lowest paid people within a business, split male and female; the second lowest paid quartile, again split between male and female; the upper middle pay quartile, again male and female; and the senior pay quartile. And that's really where the interest for us as a business is coming in, because what it's telling us is how workforces are made up and the male and female split within these workforces. Also very interesting when we look at the bonus payments, how many, the percentage of men and women who got bonus payments within a business, and what the bonus gender pay gaps were. So with the deadline of April this year, just over 10,000 employers complied with the legislation. And for the first time, we really have a very, very good picture now of what the gender pay gap is like across the country. Some of the headline statistics that we have drawn from the analysis of the 10,000 employers that have reported: on average, there's a 14% mean gender pay gap, a 15% mean bonus gender pay gap, and I've included here an example of the quartiles. And what you'll see consistently, and the reasons for the pay gap, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is that women dominate the lowest paid quartiles within most organisations. And as we move through an organisation, the number of women represented in more senior roles drops, and that's why we have a pay gap. And I think this is where, for any business who are looking at how they close the gender pay gap, it is the lower middle to the upper quartile that we really need to think about. And this is where recruitment practices and how you are recruiting and retaining and promoting talent comes into play. 85% of those 10,000 employers reported pay gaps in favour of men, and 80% of those reported a bonus pay gap in favour of men. There were some statistical anomalies which we would expect from the first year of reporting. Some companies reported significantly higher than average gender pay gaps, and some reported zero pay gaps, which is virtually impossible. So there were some statistical anomalies, but we would expect that these would change over the years ahead as this legislation continues. What I've done in the next few slides is just given you some examples of some of the pay gap information that has been reported. Ryanair had one of the highest pay gaps, but again, the interesting factor here is when we look at the pay quartiles, when we see a good number of women in the lowest quartile, 57%, then actually rising to 76%, a significant drop from that lower middle to upper middle quartile. Now, if Ryanair are looking at how they can close the pay gap, and we understand that they talked about the fact that they had more male pilots than female pilots earning the highest salaries, but there's something going wrong between that lower middle and that upper middle quartile. And how does someone like Ryanair look at actually getting more women through into that upper middle quartile of pay? I included a bank here, HSBC. This was the bank that reported the highest mean gender pay gap. Again, the story is the same, where you have a significant proportion of women in the lower middle quartile, and even making it through to the upper middle quartile, but a significant fall of 30% between that upper middle and that top quartile. And again, from a talent attraction, talent retention point of view, how are HSBC going to market themselves as an employer that is attractive to senior women looking for a role within financial services or looking to move within financial services? Oil and gas, again, you would expect that they have challenges in terms of female talent within the sector, which we know it is a challenge. But what this is doing is just really highlighting, I'm sure what many of us know in terms of getting women into challenging industry sectors where there has been that historical occupational segregation. Shell should probably take encouragement with the fact that there are 39% of women in their business at the lowest paid quartile, but be concerned around the fact that that drops significantly throughout the pay quartiles. And again, that's not uncommon within that industry sector. So just some outliers, as I mentioned, HSBC, the highest bank, Ryanair, one of the highest to report. Again, you would probably not be surprised to know that the highest pay gaps are football clubs. Coast Fashions, a female-driven business with a female consumers, was one of the highest, reporting at 71%. But then you can look at the opposite, where the care sector reported one of the highest pay gaps in favours of females at 400%. So again, none of this is a surprise to anyone working within the sector. We see high pay gaps in construction, in IT and financial services, within oil and gas, the main drivers of the UK economy, versus lower pay gaps or some pay gaps in favour of women within the care sector, within local authorities, within housing associations, more traditionally sectors where women tend to work. And this is just shining a spotlight on, again, what many of us knew. So importantly, for your perspective, in terms of how you move your business forward, I'm sure many of you who have reported on your pay gap are looking at this now, but how can employers look to really try and close the gender pay gap? First of all, at the outset, I would say that this isn't an overnight process that you can go through. This takes time. The gender pay gap didn't happen overnight. It has happened over a long period of time, decades. So the chances of closing it over 2 or 3, 4 years is minimal. Importantly, we talked to employers about a number of things, and I've listed these below. Ownership, taking accountability and being honest, admitting that there is a pay gap, recognising that it isn't a good thing, and talking about what you're going to do to close it. The detailed data analysis is very important to actually understand why and where the pay gap begins. And those pay quartiles that I highlighted are the best way of really doing that. When you look at females within your own industry potential, within your own organisation, really try and look at why these women aren't making it through. That could be due to existing recruitment practices. It could be due to internal promotion opportunities. Are you identifying female talent in the same way that you would identify male talent within your business? Competitor benchmarking is very important as well, to give you the context of where you sit as a business within that wider UK average, Scottish average, English average, but also within your industry. Are you performing well against your competitors, or are you performing poorly against your competitors? Because that's the sort of thing that you can talk to your staff about. If you find that you're in the middle, you can say, we are on average, our pay gap is on average with industry. However, we know that we still have more to do here. But often it can give people comfort, because, as I say, when people see those headline figures, and we saw this when the pay gap legislation closed and all of the figures were coming out, that many people within businesses were looking at it thinking, this is really shocking. I don't necessarily feel valued as an employee within my business, thinking that I'm earning significantly less than what my male counterparts are earning. The key thing is to commit. If you as a business want to retain, attract, promote female talent, is commit to making change. And you have to measure progress. This isn't a one-off annual exercise. This is going to be taking place from now on in terms of the UK legislation. And the UK legislation, which I'll talk about shortly, is only going to go deeper into this diversity and inclusion agenda as we see over the next few years. For many people who talk to us as a business, they say, how do I keep diversity up on the business agenda? For us as a business, we would respond to say, this is absolutely now a business imperative. It can't be ignored by organisations or employers. If you're a business that is working in the consumer-facing market, does your workforce reflect the customer base that you are serving? There's much more consumer focus now on brand commitment to diversity. If you actually look at some of the data analytics, women are much more vocal on Twitter. And you only need to see the reactions of 1 or 2 individuals that can really shape and change the agendas of companies who are maybe not putting this at front and centre. Shareholders and investors are also looking at this now when we look at the push towards quotas on boards and also at the executive committee level. And also, how can gender diversity and diversity in general support commercial growth plans within the UK? And internationally, this isn't just a UK issue, this is an international issue. So companies who are taking this seriously, who are moving forward on the agenda, will, we think, do better than those competitors who don't look at this seriously. It's not all doom and gloom. What we should say is that although we still face serious challenges, we have made progress, and we are making progress. In Scotland, we have a 50-50 target on public boards by 2020. These quotas and targets drive change, they drive different thinking, they drive different recruitment processes. The focus on board recruitment of females at the FTSE, again, has driven change, but we know that we still have a long way to go. The gender pay gap reporting law, which came in just last year, many would say that it is not perfect. What we would say in response to that, that may be the case, but it's there. The gender pay gap has been talked about in senior boardrooms, in management teams, by individuals up and down the country. Without this legislation, we wouldn't actually be here talking about this today. We also know that the UK government is looking at reporting on ethnicity over the next few years, reporting on disability within the workplace. And that creates challenges for businesses who aren't actually monitoring and tracking disability and ethnicity within the workplaces. So the more that businesses can start to look at the data that they have around diversity, the better they are going to be placed over the next few years as this agenda continues. As I said, we have a long way to go, but here are some thoughts that we have around what your organisation can do to promote diversity and inclusion. First of all, what have you done? Are you starting out on the journey, or are you looking at this seriously? Do you have sign-off at a senior level as your chief executive or your managing director taking ownership of this? Because what we find is that we have to have businesses who are serious about this they have to have ownership at the top, but ownership at the top isn't enough. It has to filter through an organisation. People can be cynical about efforts where they think that they're just paying lip service to something. So if the chief executive or the MD or the chair buys this, it has to filter throughout the conversation, throughout the whole organisation. How well do you know your workforce? Have you undertaken any insight surveys into diversity and inclusion? That's something that we've done with a number of clients to actually try and understand, does this matter to them? What are the barriers that they face? And many businesses think that they are doing the right thing, but they often don't ask staff, what do staff want? What do staff need? Are people bringing their true selves to work? Do people come in the door on a Monday morning or an every day thinking this is a place where I feel valued, I feel included, I feel I can make a contribution? Importantly, how does your workforce reflect your customers and the clients that you're selling to? And at the end of the day, and it's something that we still need to talk about, we still face the reality of conscious and unconscious bias and discrimination within our workplaces and society. But for business, this means success. If you're a business that takes diversity and inclusion seriously, you will succeed. You will do better than those who don't. You will increase employee satisfaction. You will improve decision making, and I'll move on to a couple of slides in the future where we talk about the actual statistics around that. And reputation wise, you will enhance your company's image. Here's some of the information that's been coming up in the press over the last few months, just around the pay gap and some of the targets that are being set. Companies who are not doing this are being named and shamed, not just in the pay gap, in the boardroom, in ethnicity, in disability, and in LGBT. And finally, just in the last few slides, we talk about what we call the diversity dividend. This looks at the McKinsey research, which said that companies in the top quartile for gender equality are 22% more likely to outperform the industry average. As I mentioned earlier, the statistics on the economic boost by closing the gender pay gap, by getting full representation from the Black and ethnic minority community. Ethnically diverse businesses are 35% more likely to outperform competitors. The increase in employment rate amongst disabled adults and what that would contribute to our economy. And what we would say is that the evidence is clear that there is a financial penalty for businesses who don't embrace diversity and inclusion. So just as we come to the end of the slides, take ownership, as I mentioned before, start the journey, understand your diversity position. Many companies that talk to us will say, we're going to do unconscious bias training, we're going to set up a female network, we're going to look at mentoring, sponsoring. But have you actually asked staff what they're looking for? Have you actually looked at the data first? Because businesses who maybe rush into taking steps won't know the baseline that they're starting from, and it'll be harder to measure progress. Have the responsibility and ownership from the top. Bring diversity into mainstream business strategy. It has to filter throughout the organisation. You have to monitor and track progress. And capturing that data is really important moving forward. It can't be ignored. Many of you will have been aware of the furore when the BBC announced their gender pay gap figures. Starbucks recently closed all of their stores in America. Again, I'm sure you're all aware of this, for a day to undergo unconscious bias training due to a racist incident in one of their stores. and we're very open about it. Starbucks are a good example of a company that said what we did was wrong, we are sorry, we take this seriously, and we're going to do something about it. And when companies are honest and they take responsibility, they have accountability, and they do something about it, those businesses are going to do better than those who look at this once a year when the pay gap reporting is due and then file it in the drawer for another day. This is just some final information about the kind of work that we do, very much looking at customer analytics, workforce analytics, surveys, insights, helping businesses to understand what their workforce is doing, looking at gender pay gap data, supporting on pay gap narratives. But I hope that's been helpful to you in terms of just outlining where we are in the UK. Some of the figures, as I said at the start, may make for uncomfortable viewing and listening to, but the important thing is we're talking about it. We still have a long way to go. There are many organisations out there who are committed to change, and I think collectively, as an economy, the more that we can do to shine a light on this, the more that we can do to talk about this as a business benefit, the statistics, the evidence is there, the quicker we will start to see change. So that's the presentation finished, and I'll hand back to Sooz.
Thanks, Jane. That was a lot of information. I have to say that I think there's another 3 webinar sessions there with the questions that I have alone. But we do have about maybe 6 questions. And if you've got any questions, please do keep them coming in, and we'll do our best maybe just to spend 5 more minutes just sort of looking at the information that we've got. So Jane, just a quick one here, and there's a couple of questions. I'll put my glasses on. Do you think the gender pay gap legislation goes far enough?
So some people have said that the legislation is flawed because the vast majority of companies within the UK are actually small to medium-sized enterprises. But what we would say is that this is very much a starting point. The fact is that 10,000 employers published on the deadline day in April this year. It's the first time that any country actually has looked at this to such an extent. The data is public, it's out there. Any individual in the UK can go in and look at employers. Importantly, they can look at competitors. So if you're actually in the recruitment and the hiring part of your business, what impression does that send to potentially female talent that you're looking to try and recruit? And I shouldn't just say female talent, because it also actually impacts on male recruitment as well. Are you a business that's taking this seriously? Are you a business that's open and honest about the gender pay gap? The pay gap is what it is, but the more open, transparent, and talking about what you plan to do about the pay gap is what's important. So I think it's a really important first step. I think that more can be done, but I think we have to give it a few years before we can really sort of reach any firm conclusions.
Cool. And I've got another one here. I've got another Jane actually in the room. How do I get the diversity and inclusion agenda taken more seriously in my organisation? So this is from a sort of HR person who needs the buy-in from the management team.
Yeah, that question comes up a lot in terms of this isn't taken seriously. Organisations are paying lip service to it. I would say it depends on the business, it depends on the organisation. Often when we talk to companies, we'll say, well, what's your pain point? What's your biggest challenge? If it's around retaining staff, then diversity and inclusion has to come in. If it's about attracting staff, again, diversity and inclusion has to come in. Often the way we can look at it is by saying to a business, well, let's look at what your competitors are doing. And if competitors are really taking this seriously, if they're really striving forward, if they're looking to make changes, then that's often what can drive behavioural change within the organisation you're working for. Businesses also like to see statistics, they like stats. So if you're also able to look at some of your diversity data, potentially looking at ethnicity within your workforce, disability within your workforce, that can be what really shines a light on this to say, look, we really need to do more around this.
There is gaps there. Okay. I do have another couple of questions. Actually, there's something that came up just from myself around the point of the gender pay gap and equal pay. I didn't realise there was actually a difference between equal pay versus gender pay gap. Maybe you can come back and do another session for us and talk about that one. I think that's an educational point of view for everybody. So I've got another question here as well. Are diversity targets really what's needed to force change?
So we would say, based on the lack of progress over the years, we would say that targets are the way forward, for a number of reasons. It changes behaviours. If we look at the focus on FTSE boards in terms of recruiting women to those positions, it forces recruitment change. It forces people to think about it. It forces people to look at how they are recruiting, where they are recruiting. If businesses say, we tried to find a woman, but it was just the same men that applied, we didn't get any women actually applying for the role. Well, where are you recruiting as a business? How are you recruiting? How do you write your adverts? Where are you, what sort of language are you using? There's a huge industry now in terms of gender-based language linked to recruitment, and that's something that's really important. The legislation on the gender pay gap, as I mentioned, has forced companies to look at this in a way that's never been done before. And what we would think is that many businesses know it. They know by looking across the office floor that they have an issue. But when someone sees something in black and white and they can see it next to their competitors, then that's what drives change. And also internally, from people within the business, people questioning it, members of staff talking to their boss, talking to their colleagues. Why do we have this pay gap? Why is this an issue? Why don't we have more people from ethnic minorities working here? And I think individuals are becoming much more educated around that in the workforce as well.
Yeah, I think in recruitment here at Solutions Driven, that's a key thing for us, which is why we use the analytics software, because the sort of Q chart offers that non-biased representation of who's actually through, what their scorecard results were, etc. And it's a good way to keep yourselves right. With regards to time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to take another one from the board. What is your view on positive discrimination?
So that's an interesting one. So companies will talk to us about that a lot. We would always say, for any role, for any business that you're recruiting in, you have to have the best person for the job. So I think we have to keep that front and centre in our minds. If you're recruiting, you want to recruit the best for the job. Now, you can look at putting in all-female shortlists if you think, we want to really get a woman in that role, or you could look at saying we want a 50-50 split on all senior hires or on any hires. So these are steps that many companies are actually taking. The pushback, and we do get pushback from men, talking to men within businesses to say, well, actually, this is going to have a bias against men. All of this D&I, the gender pay gap, what about men? Men are potentially being left behind. And I think that we have to recognise that, because if businesses are telling us that, or if people are saying it to us, we have to be cognizant of that fact. The pushback to that would be, well, the statistics will tell otherwise. Men aren't being left behind on this. But there are ways that you can still focus on getting the best person for the job, but widening your recruitment pool, widening where you recruit from, and also importantly, when we look at those pay quartiles again, how are you promoting female talent versus how are you promoting male talent? Is your business, still tapping people on the shoulder? Is it about the person that's in the office the longest hours? How flexible is your work culture? Do women want to go forward for promotion because they might actually think, well, I don't want that job because I know that job comes with X, Y, and Z, and I don't necessarily want the baggage that comes with it. So that's why it's important also to really speak to your female staff and actually understand what their ambitions and aspirations are. So I was saying, to sort of long answer to what was a short question, look at splits within targets for recruitment, and some companies have been quite open and honest about that, particularly at senior levels, saying that when they go out to recruiters, when they go to get shortlists, they want a 50-50 shortlist, or they won't take anything forward. And I think that's something that a lot of businesses are starting to look at.
Yeah, I would agree. We get that. We do get that very, very often. I have never seen so many questions come in, Jane. This is one of the. We'll have to do this session again if that's okay with you. I think later on, and put some more time aside for actually just a straightforward question. So the last question of the day: is there anyone out there getting this right?
Again, people ask that. Well, what's the kind of gold star out there? Who's doing this well? I would say that the statistics don't lie, so there's no one that's getting this 100%. There's certain businesses that are making progress. There are businesses who get that this is absolutely crucial to their future success. The reason why I included Starbucks was because when that incident happened in the States in terms of the racial discrimination, they immediately dealt with it, they actioned it, they did something about it. They were prepared to take that profit hit for a day of closed stores because they valued their reputation, they valued their customers, they valued their public image, but they also recognised that what they did was wrong, and they were very honest and open about that. So these are good examples of businesses who, when they do face challenges, they own up to it and they get it right and they do something about it. So I would say that no one is perfect. We absolutely still have a long way to go, but we're on a journey. The more companies that join the journey, I think the better our society will be. But it's not just the right thing to do, it's the business imperative to do. It's about profitability, it's about getting the best people for the job, it's about bringing that diversity of thought into your organisation, it's about making people happy, inclusive, they feel good at their work, and people that are like that, who work in an inclusive environment, are going to work better for those businesses.
Thanks, Jane. That was fantastic. We have now run out of time. I'm wary of we could answer questions all day. So what we will do is we'll get back to individuals on their own, just a few more questions that we did get. But just a gentle reminder as well, we'll be sending out a copy of the recording from today's sessions, and I'll include the Q&A session as well, so you can get those just in the next 24 hours. I might get a chance to do them today for you. And I'd just like to thank you, Jane, again for coming in and working with us in Solutions Driven to do this presentation. It was fantastic.
Pleasure.
And thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll hopefully have another session very soon. Thank you.